Hello and welcome to Save Democracy. I'm Catherine Davies. Democracy is the idea that the people are at the heart of society. We, the people, determine who governs us, and anyone who works in politics or public service serves us. They are meant to act in good faith on our behalf and solve the challenges of governance effectively. In parliamentary democracy, representatives are elected by us and, just as importantly, can be removed by us. And holding power to account runs through the whole system of checks and balances, including an independent judiciary and a free and independent media. But we all know there are serious problems with this picture in many countries, with a loss of trust in politicians, partisan polarisation, whipped up online by algorithms designed to reward hostility, and many other dysfunctions. Entrepreneurial populists stand ready with their slogans and easy answers. Few of us have the time, ourselves, to become informed enough about the issues to be able to collectively work together to try to make a difference. After all, isn't that the job of the people we elect? On Save Democracy, we are on a journey to unpack this whole story and how it manifests worldwide and what we can do about it. So I was excited to hear about something that could be a positive, constructive part of an effective response to these challenges. And its latest iteration is a positive use of AI. Our guest today, Professor James Fishkin, is a world expert in deliberative democracy, runs the Deliberative Democracy Lab at Stanford University, and has worked all over the world for many years in developing and refining a way to reinvigorate democracy by connecting the will of the people to what is actually done in their name. Welcome, Jim.
Hello, nice to be here.
Great to have you here. Jim published a book last year, Can Deliberation Cure the Ills of Democracy? It's a wonderful book, and it gives examples worldwide of what he's about to talk about. Could we start, Jim, with an explanation as to what is deliberative polling, deliberative democracy, when it is well designed, a lesson I learned from your book, how important that is, and the story from maybe Texas to illustrate?
I'd be delighted. Well, look, let me start with the point that you made, which was very important, which I emphasize in the book, that fundamentally democracy is about deliberative democracy is about making a connection between the will of the people and what's actually done. And I think that's fundamental to any defensible version of democracy as compared to authoritarian regimes, which do not pay attention to the will of the people or just try to manipulate it if they can. So deliberative democracy is a matter of creating conditions where the people or a representative microcosm of them can weigh the competing arguments, the reasons for doing one thing rather than another. And if it's done properly, and I will describe the way that we have been doing it in projects around the world now for a number of years, the results can be quite surprising. They're quite surprising, first of all, in that the people make a lot of sense and they can deal with difficult issues. It's quite surprising in the sense that the polarization which you referred to, which divides us so strongly and seems to be so entrenched, is not so entrenched, that people, when they learn to listen to the other side, actually will often change their views in both directions so that they move closer together. They achieve a better understanding of the problems before them. And it's quite surprising in terms of how they end up voting even a year later. So all of these factors we apply in a microcosm of the people, a representative sample. Now, the representative sample has to be large enough to be statistically meaningful. It has to be representative in its demographics, but it also should be representative in its attitudes, because why should we listen to a group of people who've been recruited and pay attention to how they change if we don't know where they started? But if they start roughly where the rest of the population starts, and they move in a coherent direction for coherent reasons, that should have weight with decision makers. And it often has in countries around the world. And one of the projects in America was a humdrum sort of issue that nobody paid much attention to, but it was quite important. It was how Texas, which was growing very fast and still is growing very fast, should provide electricity to its residents. And the Public Utility Commission required all the big companies to consult the public about it. So the utility companies had a problem because they knew that the public didn't focus on the issue, didn't know much about it. And in fact, the discovery of what the great public opinion researcher from the University of Michigan, Phil Converse, had called non-attitudes. I've been calling them ever since phantom opinions, but people never like to say they don't know. And so they'll almost at random pick an alternative rather than admit they don't know.
Is this with like normal polling, normal questionnaires?
Yeah, in conventional polling. And that was discovered in a question about electric utilities. So I immediately saw the opportunity to see, well, what would the people really think about electric utilities? Because it seems like a boring issue, and it's not one that people focus on, and it's complicated in terms of different energy sources and costs and effects on the environment and the rest of it. And most people, most of the time, as you noted, don't think about the complexities of policy. They are, in the famous words of the political economist Anthony Downs, rationally ignorant. If I've got one vote in millions, why should I spend a lot of time thinking about complicated issues? Because I've got other things where my time is better devoted, my job, my family, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the condition of much of the public on many issues, and including certainly electric utilities. So we did these projects. We did 8 of them with good samples for every part of Texas with the Electric Utility Commission, who made the ultimate decision. And the companies had to consult the public and say how their plans for the future related to the people's preferences. And lo and behold, in all 8 projects, the people were actually willing to pay more on their electricity bills in order to support investments in renewable energy, wind power and solar energy. Wind power was particularly cost effective at the time. And now solar power has come online too. And so the percentage willing to pay more, even a little more, went from something like 50% to 85%. All of that's in my book. That's an approximation of what the average was over 8. And so this astonished the commission, it astonished the companies. So there was a significant investment in wind power in every one of their plans that they had to file. Those were adopted. And this was then shared with enthusiasm by the commission with the legislature, who added on requirements for renewable energy with enthusiasm as a result of that's being what the people wanted. And over the course of years, this just built more and more momentum for investments in wind power in Texas. And Texas went from being last among the 50 states in the United States, that is, it had the lowest amount of wind power of all 50 states, to being first by 2007, surpassing California. And it's never looked back. It's way ahead of every other state. As a direct result of these plans, where the people came to these conclusions. And this was not just in the rich areas, but even in the very poor areas of Texas, because it was clean and it was cost effective. And they didn't want the pollution of coal, which was the other low cost investment. But they also were willing to tolerate some investments in natural gas, which is a lot cleaner than coal, but it still has emissions that raise important issues. So that was the compromise. No coal, some gas, and some renewable energy. That was, I think, an important contribution to the energy portfolio in Texas, and still is.
Could you maybe bring to life a little bit for our listeners and viewers how it actually works, and who informs the information that they receive as they go through a deliberative polling process.
Yeah, well, there are these options. In this case, the options were obvious because it was about how they were going to get their energy. So it could be coal, natural gas. Nuclear was off the table at the time, but came in for later projects because it was all tied up in litigation. But coal, natural gas, renewable energy, demand side management, which is a fancy term for conservation. So you can
Using
deal
less.
with you use less, and you can encourage people to use less, or you can pipe the energy in that case from Mexico. So they were the viable alternatives, and there were pros and cons for every one of them. And so we got an advisory committee that represented all the stakeholders that could be relevant, the big customers, the advocates of all the different forms of energy, the consumer groups who were basically concerned about the costs the consumers would have to pay, and the Environmental Defense Fund and other such groups. So
and the companies were involved?
The companies had representatives. We had a working group that created the materials, and they were vetted for balance and accuracy by the advisory group until we got an agreement. And then we also had I insisted on a media partner. And so we had PBS, the television network, locally broadcast the culminating events for each of them so that the public would be aware of the deliberations and the process. So here's the process. You take a survey, and then these people are invited. And as we developed the process over the years, we also would make them controlled experiments. We would have separate control groups who were randomly selected just to take the survey. But in this case,
that's a group who are surveyed at the beginning and end, but they don't actually participate in the polling.
That's right. But we didn't have those in Texas, but we added them as the years went on. Yeah. But we could compare the people who accepted the invitation with the people who didn't in terms of their attitudes and demographics. So we were able to judge the attitudinal and demographic representativeness of the people, and we did extremely well. And then they take a confidential survey, then they're invited, all their expenses are paid. These were face-to-face projects. And so the first was in Corpus Christi, Texas, and people from all over the area were brought in. They spent a weekend in Corpus Christi, which is quite a nice place, depending on the time of year. It's on the seaside. And they deliberated in small groups with trained moderators. We had to train the moderators. And then there were plenary sessions where questions from the small groups would be directed to competing experts, and all the same representatives who were on the advisory group, all those points of view would be represented in each plenary session. But the experts were not allowed to give speeches. They were only allowed to directly answer the questions that the people thought were most important for them to make a decision about that part of the agenda. And so this went on for an entire weekend. And then at the end...
And those materials they were given laid out all the pros and cons of the different options.
That's right.
And they had all been vetted for balance.
That's right. That's right. Then as we developed this process, we would also make a video version of the briefing materials. Some people find it more comfortable with a video version, and so now we always do that as well. But at the beginning, we didn't have the video. So those changes of opinion, and as I said, on the renewable energy, it was considered to be quite remarkable, particularly that the public, even in the poor areas in Texas, would support paying a bit more in order to get a clean air process, which was renewable energy, as part of the portfolio.
So I may not necessarily refer to Texas, but just to a general experience over many years of all these different polls. What has been the experience of the participants? How has that impacted them?
Well, they bond. They actually talk about, could they have a reunion? People don't normally meet others who are very different from themselves. And so it's a bit like serving on a jury. You know, they make friends and they find it very engaging. They didn't necessarily think it would be, but they do. And we find that it has an effect on them months later. And indeed, in other projects, we've gone back to them systematically a year later and found it creates more engaged and informed citizens. They pay more attention to political campaigns, to political issues. They tend to vote at higher levels. They also come out with more respect for the people they disagree with. And there's an increase in trust in institutions as a result of this also. So, and not just at the end of the weekend, but months later. And all of these civic effects we find almost regardless of the topic. And we also find them with the online process, which we've developed, which makes the whole process much more accessible and cost effective because you don't need human moderators, you don't need the travel, you don't need the hotels.
Do they still bond?
They do, to my surprise. They do.
Has the same civic effects
It
downstream?
does. It does. We've demonstrated that in peer-reviewed scholarly journals, and it has the same lasting effects. We did a big one on climate change that was with our online process. In the online process, people see each other, as you and I see each other, in small groups of 10, and there's no human moderator. The AI empowers the people in the group to moderate the discussion, strange as that may sound, in the sense that there's a queue for talking of 45 seconds at a time, so nobody can dominate the discussion. It nudges people to sign up for the queue if they haven't signed up. People wait their turn and prepare for their comment on that proposal, so they choose their words carefully. It intervenes if people are being uncivil and puts that issue to the group. It guides the people in coming up with their key questions. It asks them to type them in or speak them into a process where everybody can see them on the screen and they can be edited by the others. And then they agree on a version of that. And then they vote for the top questions. And the top two are taken to the agenda for the plenary session with the experts.
The AI moderator is able to keep this very neutral
Right.
space.
And in fact, when the participants are asked, we give them the same evaluation questions afterwards that we have used for years for the human moderators. And the AI gets ratings at least as high as the human moderators do for balance. Have we discussed the competing sides of all the questions adequately? Is there any bias, et cetera, et cetera? The AI always comes out at or near the top.
And I'm assuming you use the Stanford engineering talent to develop that.
That's right. It's a collaboration with them, and they're great.
And given the latest news, I have to ask this question. Is there a way to seal off this process so the AI moderator doesn't take it on their own bat to reinterpret the instructions they've been given?
No. It's not in the direction of agentic AI, but let's call it AI assisted. There's a whole series of tasks that a human moderator would do that this AI does, and it has a voice, which is the voice of my associate, Alice Hugh, who's the associate director of my lab. She has a very pleasing voice, and it's not agentic AI that could independently take over the process.
Very good. And you can imagine with this online platform that you have and demonstrated in many places and in many contexts, it's all in the book, with the AI moderator, that this can be scaled to some degree. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that. I know you're involved in national experiments in this, and it'd be great to hear a bit about that.
So my idea, which I argue for in the book, after I review the implications of deliberative democracy on the model that we've designed, which is different from other models that other people have developed later. On our model, we get a great deal of increased mutual respect. We get very dramatic depolarization of party differences, and we get effects on how people vote.
Both directions, doesn't it, in terms of...
Yeah. It's not, the Republicans change, but the Democrats change too.
Yeah.
And they listen to each other. And the good reasons, I think, can be used as a route to responsible advocacy, because these are the reasons that a representative sample of the people would accept and support, that have weight with the public once they know about it.
And I imagine the media coverage must be quite important to help with that legitimacy and for the public to understand how the whole process worked.
Yes, it is important. And it's easier to get media coverage if it's face-to-face than if it's online.
Yes.
But the online process with the results sometimes has had good coverage too. And we've done this in many countries. It's even required by law in one country where we used it to change the constitution. I should tell you about that.
Mongolia, right?
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
they use it for constitutional change. Could we
Yeah.
maybe speak a moment about the national scaling?
Okay. So my idea was the limitation of the process is that only the people drawn for a deliberative poll, only the people drawn in the sample are directly affected. And so what about everybody else? Well, wouldn't it be nice if they could have a similar experience, particularly since we found that the composition of the small groups doesn't actually matter so much for the changes. It doesn't matter for the direction of changes. The initial composition might vary, but if you had self-selected groups, nevertheless, you would get mostly changes in the same direction, or that seems to be what we found in a lot of experiments.
I guess it points to perception of legitimacy is getting that initial sample.
Well, yes, I think it's essential. It's essential for if you're going to make policy recommendations to have a representative sample, which is my problem with many of the citizens' assemblies, which even in Ireland and in France at the national level, they didn't collect any information about where the people started on the issues. And so you didn't know if the conclusions were the result of the deliberation or how much of the conclusions were the result of the people who volunteered themselves to be part of the discussion. So I think that although I thought the anytime you get ordinary people deliberating together, the results can be quite wonderful. But I think that it's better to have a more rigorously recruited sample. But because of the byproducts of deliberation,
the civic effects.
I've had my idea for some time on the idea of scaling the process. Mm-hmm. So there's a project in the UK that's led by two retired government officials. It's called the National Strategy. Catherine Day and Sir Matthew Rycroft have organized this. They're a great team, and they've brought in all kinds of people, including a group at Cambridge, to be involved in this project. And I've done a lot of travel to the UK. But the idea would be to identify the key challenges facing the future of the UK and prepare deliberative polls about them. But once we have the deliberative materials, to also foster scaling of the deliberation with those same materials, with as many collaborative organizations as we can recruit. And we're in the midst of raising the money for that. But now that it's gone public, so I can talk about it. And we're working on it intensively.
However it's constructed, the civic effects, just the civic effects alone, are fantastic. That happens routinely.
Yes, I think so too. And that's one of the arguments. So instead of thinking that our divisions are intractable and democracy is hopeless for getting anything done, we've got examples all over the world. We've done 160 deliberative polls around the world, and many of them have had impacts on policy just as strong or maybe even more dramatic than those Texas ones that you dug out of my past. And they've sometimes on issues that seemed, very difficult. And in fact, in some countries, the more difficult the issues, the more attractive it is to share responsibility for a solution with the people, because there's going to be, some negative fallout no matter what you choose. And so if you bring the people into the decision process in a representative and thoughtful way, which is what we think we can do,
yes.
You can help lay out the direction for a solution.
And can I just ask about how AI positively intersects with this work and can help enable scaling, and just any comments you wanted to make about that?
Well, the platform we have is AI assisted, and like everything with AI, it changes by the month or by the day. In other words, it's all kinds of improvements. But people like the platform.
You have transcriptions, don't you?
Automatic transcription, and then we have large language models that help us understand the reasons, the arguments for and against that people are using for each of the proposals. And so when we want to explain why people changed their views or why they came to the conclusions that they did, we normally or previously had relied upon the questionnaire, explanatory variables that we could anticipate and put in the pre and post questionnaires. But now we can actually look at the reasons that people use during the process, and that adds a lot in each small group. It combines the qualitative and the quantitative in a systematic way.
Yes.
So we can understand why people conclude what they did about proposals.
Would you mind speaking a little bit to the shy citizen? If a shy citizen is caught up in the random sampling and they're selected to be part of the weekend and they're interested in it, but they've said they've agreed to it, but they're not great at group discussions. I know you said that the AI nudges everybody that hasn't contributed, but I wonder, have you noticed any effects for people like that who perhaps, because there's always questions around different people can effortlessly communicate and there's a tendency they can dominate discussions. And I just wonder how your model counters those effects.
Well, we know the number of seconds that each, or if it's on the platform, or when we record the face-to-face ones, it's the same. But we know the number of seconds that each person participates. And the participation is pretty equal by every kind of metric that you can devise. After a while, people learn to listen and they get involved. And if somebody suggests an issue that turns into a group question, the norm is that it's the person who first suggested the issue who ends up participating in voicing the question in the plenary session before all the hundreds of people. And there was one case where a woman, this was in the UK, didn't get to ask her question because time was running out. And she held up her hand and insisted that she ask it. And she did. And it was a good question. But the moderator of her group told me that at the beginning of the process, she couldn't get her to say anything. She was so shy. But by the time she had been selected by the group to do this question and she had practiced how she would articulate it, and she wanted the chance to do it, by golly, she was going to do it. And she did. Having the group behind her was empowering because they thought it was a really good question, and it was. So I think that's not too unusual. The process brings out viewpoints from everybody. And it doesn't mean that everybody has to talk exactly the same, although very often they do. What it means is we want people, and we all know that sometimes there are occasions where some people talk too much and have less influence as a result. But the platform is even better than the human moderators at evening out the discussion in terms of how long people talk. And if you have a civil atmosphere, and very quickly the people who might in other circumstances disrupt the discussion pick up on the idea that that's not what this is about. This is about listening as much as talking and contributing when you have something to say.
Can I ask you, with all of your experience around the world, is there a particularly inspiring process that you've witnessed or been part of that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, we did a project in Bulgaria about the condition of the Roma. This was a big national project. And there was this New York Times reporter who showed up. Nicholas Wood was his name. And he wanted to see the moderator training in every aspect of it. And I said, great, here. And so we invited him to that. And then he happened to say, I showed up because I knew you would fail. And I said, what? And he said, well, you have no idea how strong the antipathy is to the Roma. And this is going to be an intractable problem. And so I said, well, let's see. I mean, I didn't know. It's an empirical study. So we had 6% Roma in the sample, which was what as best social scientists could judge it, was the appropriate number. And
as a representation in the wider population.
Yeah, exactly. And we had this thing unfolding in this big auditorium that was left over from the Soviet era days, and it was nationally televised. And we had the prime minister opening the process, and as a welcome. And the people moved dramatically in support of the Roma. For example, because it was about the schooling, the housing, and the criminal justice system, all of which greatly disadvantaged the Roma. And on the schooling, there was a big movement in favor of closing down the Roma-only schools. The Roma schooling was segregated.
Yes.
The Roma-only schools, and actually busing the children to schools with everybody else. And the overall population and the Roma themselves supported that because their kids weren't learning anything. They didn't even have teachers in the schools. They had the older children were teaching the younger children, and it was in the Roma language, not the Bulgarian language. So how could these children have any real future
prospects?
Yeah. And we were at a conference later about all our projects all over Eastern Europe. And the Bulgarian group was really ecstatic because they had just decided to desegregate the Roma-only schools. Now, I'm not saying that we were entirely responsible for it, but everybody admitted that we were a catalyst, that this was a surprising result, that such a thing could be possible. And so I'm rather
Wonderful.
proud of that.
Wonderful.
I'm rather proud of that because it showed that people could overcome their initial stereotypes and prejudice. And so he wrote, there's an article in the New York Times that he wrote, which was very favorable about deliberative polling and included interviews with the prime minister as well, and about the future of this process. So we have that on our website.
Marvelous. Marvelous, Jim. Well, if there's anything else you wanted to share about deliberative polling with our audience before we finish today?
Just that we've done this over and over in contexts where people said it wouldn't be possible. There are great divisions. There was the Bulgarian issue about the Roma, but we've done it in Northern Ireland. We've done it in developing countries where I had trouble getting it off the ground because there were early experiments in deliberative democracy, not on my model, but on other models where some American researchers concluded that deliberative democracy might be great for highly developed countries, but it wouldn't work in Africa. And I eventually succeeded in getting a collaboration across Africa. It was called the Resilience African Network, and it was supported by USAID. So we did projects in Uganda, Ghana, Senegal, Malawi. Malawi may be the poorest country in Africa, Tanzania. And in every case, we made some adjustments to the process in the sense that we had much more extensive video versions of the briefing materials. And we had oral administration of the questionnaire, so they didn't have to fill out a written questionnaire. But otherwise, the process was just the same. And the people were very smart, and the local governments implemented the results. And so I think that everywhere we go, the people have the capacity to deliberate together about their common problems. And you just have to make the effort so that you can bring the competing choices and arguments to life in a responsible, evidence-based way and create a civil environment for a microcosm of the people to grapple with the issues and question competing experts. It works over and over and has salutary effects. And I think that's what democracy is ultimately about. It's about connecting the will of the people to what's actually done. And it can be done because otherwise you end up with a form of democracy which is just attack ads and vilification spread online to people who never hear the other side because they're caught in their enclaves or filter bubbles for the viewpoints that they find congenial. And democracy just becomes a matter of mobilization. That version of democracy is destined for deadlock, for not solving the people's problems. And that doesn't match up well to the threat of authoritarianism, which some people believe can get things done and a strong man can solve the people's problems. I don't believe that at all. But we need more than just party competition democracy. We need party competition democracy with opportunities for deliberation by the people and opportunities for those deliberations to be consequential. So that's the theme of my book. Some of the people in this space of deliberative democracy have gone to the point that they want to get rid of elected representatives and just replace them with random samples of the public. And I don't support that. What I support is people have died for the right to vote in elections. And I support making our representative democracy function so that it connects to the public will. And that's what my book is about. And to do that, we need not just on particular occasions, but we need lots of occasions, and we need to bring deliberation into the schools as a form of civic education. We need to spread it more widely in all kinds of contexts.
Wonderful to start those civic effects young. And,
Yes.
And as you argue so eloquently in your book, it's a complement to parliamentary democracy.
That's what I think it should become.
We certainly need it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. It's been wonderful.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.
If you enjoyed this episode, please post a review or rating. We're new, and a one-line review has a huge impact in helping others to find us. Thank you for your support.